favourites there.
If you had to write a dictionary definition of what an Australian style of blues is, how would you describe it?
Oh, well, you'd have to say that it's a part of Mother Blues, and Mother Blues has given birth to jazz, rock and roll, country music. It's it's the basis of every part of modern music, and if you tell an Australian story, well, that's pretty much what Oz Blues is, using many of the same instruments, many of the same techniques, but also some new, some individualized techniques too, that makes Oz Blues a little bit, that makes it a music of its own. And I don't know how the dictionary would handle that, but that's pretty much the way I see it.
What do you think it was about blues that initially struck a chord with you?
Well, in my show, the introduction to Oz Blues, I tell a story about how in Brisbane in 1965, I come back from Melbourne. I've got shoulder-length hair, and the police pick me up, take me to a police station, and get a razor blade and cut my hair. Now, Queensland in those days, and every now and then they have a relapse, was a police state. And you could get away, like, you imagine what would happen today if you got a 16-year-old kid and cut his hair. But they could get away with it. And I think, because I used to sit up late at night watching the news with my dad, and I can remember clearly looking at all the Selma and all of these places where, the Afro-Americans were trying to get civil rights. And I knew what it was like to live under those conditions of not having complete freedom and probably being hated because of the way you looked and the way you felt. So it wasn't that I was thinking that stuff all the time, but it was just around me. And when I heard the blues, it just lit a fuse in my head.
How difficult was it as a young lad in Brisbane wanting to learn about blues and to actually track down the records of the blues?
Oh, nearly impossible.
Yeah, imagine.
Nearly impossible. Luckily, there was a few record shops, second-hand record shops, where they'd bring in a whole pile of singles. I think they may have been from jukeboxes, and they'd sell them at 20 cents each. And I'd just go through them, and especially Jimmy Reed stuff. I had tons of Jimmy Reed singles, and they were $2 bob each. And whenever I had two shillings, I'd go and buy a Jimmy Reed. And there was also this a label called Custom. I think it was German. And they had all Oompa music, but they also had a few B.B. King albums and Elmore James. So, Jimmy Reed and Elmore James, I knew their music a lot better than I knew Muddy Waters or people like that, John Lee Hooker. I had to go to Melbourne to get John Lee Hooker album.
What about trying to find like-minded musicians to work with in those days with a similar love for the blues? Was that a bit of a treasure hunt too?
Well, that was an amazing synchronicity, really, as these things always are. When I got back from Melbourne and I wanted to form a traditional blues band. I wasn't interested in doing hits at all. I wanted to, I wanted to do, traditional blues. There was this fish shop just at the back of my place, and all the bikers and everything would hang out there. And I knew most of them, so I'd hang out with them. And one day a guy walks in, he's got yellow and black trousers and shoulder-length hair. And I started talking to him, and he was a blues enthusiast like I was, and his name was Paul Johnson. And we started to talk, and I said, look, I'm going to form a traditional blues band. He says, I've already got a couple of players that I'm playing with, and would you like to, try out with our band? And I said, only if you're going to play traditional blues. I said, I'm not interested in doing, hits. And he says, look, he says, if you've got the material, we'll do it. And I said, well, I've certainly got the material. So I tried out with the band. It didn't have a name or anything. And that band became the Bay City Union. We got together right at the end of '65 and did our first gig the 14th of February 1966.
Ah, Decimal Currency Day.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's why I remember it so well, yeah. I think it might have been the day before. I think it was a Sunday, Decimal Currency Day, and I think it was a Saturday. If the Saturday was Decimal Currency Day, then that was it. But that was exactly the time, and it's also my sister's birthday, so I couldn't really forget it. 14th of February 1966.
Was it tough to find work for a traditional blues band around Brisbane in those days?
Well, I don't think anyone knew what we were doing. We just, like, I can remember we probably had off about 8 songs, and the guitarist's father, the guitarist's name was Jimmy Brailsford, great little guitarist. He's not with us anymore, as Paul Johnson isn't with us anymore. And Jimmy's dad got us a gig, and we were saying, oh, look, we can't do a gig. We only know 8 songs. He says, we'll go and play them twice. So our first gig, we went and played our repertoire twice. And then once we'd done the first gig, that was on the 14th of February 1966, you couldn't stop us. We just wanted to do whatever we could. And there was the top band in town was called the Purple Hearts, wonderful rhythm and blues band, and they had just there was a fellow named Glenn Wheatley of Johnny Farnham fame these days. Mm-hmm. Now Glenn Wheatley opened up a little blues club called, and he had his own band. They were called the Vacant Lot. And he opened up a little blues club called the St. George Club. It was in a church hall. And for the first couple of nights that it was open, the Purple Hearts played there. But then the Purple Hearts went down to Melbourne, and there was only really one band, blues band in town that could take their place, and that was the Bay City Union, my band. So we went into the St. George Club, and the top sort of pop gig in town was called The Scene. It was one of Ivan Damon's, and they sent a guy up and saw that the St. George Club was just packed out with the people that they wanted at The Scene. So they approached us and said, look, come and play at the scene Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night, and we'll give you $20 each. Well, I'm working for $7.90 or something. Of course, these are $1960. They actually were worth something. And so the St. George Club closed down anyway because it was in a church hall and there was just too many liquor bottles on Sunday morning for the parishioners to plough through. So we left it just at the right time, and we played and it was good playing the scene because that was for Ivan Damon, and all the big shows like the festival halls and everything, we got to do all those shows. So, whenever Normie Rowe or someone came, the old Bay City Union would go on and play traditional blues, and, then a couple of pop bands would go on. So we sort of hit the tarmac running.
Yeah. Now, your next band was a band called Genesis, not to be confused with the British band of the
That's
same
right,
name. Yeah. You were trying to establish that band, and the invite came to join Chain. Was that a tough decision to make there?
Not really. Again, you go back to the little history I do, and I just tell the story of, I tell the story about Genesis and how it's in the supergroup era, and all the pop guys get together and form a band called Axiom, and all the alternative guys, that's anyone who wasn't playing pop music, got together and formed Genesis. And eventually I've got Genesis, it's a 4-piece band, and I have to go into AMBO, the big agency that gives you all the work, and I'd be waiting to see the big wigs there, and I'd be talking to the office boy. He was 17 years old. He'd just left school, and his dad was calling him a bum. He was at Melbourne Grammar, and he'd left school because he wanted to get into show business. So, this kid just had more front than Myers. And one day he comes to a Genesis gig and says, Matt, he says, those guys at that agency, he says, they spend 3 hours on you a week if. I'm going to start my own agency, and I'd like you to come in as the premier band there, and I'll just spend half of each day just working on you. I said, gee, you're a bit young. And he said, oh, no. He says, I can pull this off. And, of course, this young man's name was Michael Gudinski. And so, as I say in the show, he was obviously going to go on and, be one of the greatest promoters Australia's ever seen. But no matter who you are, when you're starting off, you need someone to give you a bit of encouragement and to believe in you.
Yeah, for sure.
I was happy enough to do that. So what happens then is I have a great guitarist who had been in Chain but had left and joined Genesis. His name was Timmy Piper. He was a Kiwi, and he came up and said, Matt, he says, look, I've got some problems back in New Zealand. I've got to go back. I hate to break up the band. And I said, oh, look, that's fine, Tim. You do it. And I'd heard that Chain had broken up in Brisbane. And so I sent a telegram to Phil Manning because I wanted to play with Phil again. And I said, Phil, come down and join Genesis. Plenty of work. Everything's going well. About 4 days later, I get a letter, and the letter says, Chain hasn't broken up. I'm with your 2 old mates, Barry Harvey and Barry Sullivan, and we're playing at the Red Orb. Why don't you come up and join Chain? So I go and see Michael and say, look, I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is I've got to break up Genesis. And he goes, oh, you'll be recording soon. Everything's going well. And I said, but I'm going up to join Chain. He said, what, you and Chain together? I said, yep, that'll be the new Chain. He says, only if I can be manager. He says, you make me manager of that band, and by the time you get back to Melbourne, you'll be the biggest band in town. So basically, I just went up to Brisbane, and to follow that on, at the very first rehearsal, we just go through everything we know. We just make up songs, because we have to. It's a Wednesday, and we have to play that Friday, and so we just get off a whole pile of material. And then when it's finished, Phil's just sitting there on his guitar, and we're packing up, and he's playing dum da 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 da. And I go, Phil, what's that riff? He says, it's just something I've been mucking around with. And I said, look, guys, sit down. I'm just going to write out a whole pile of heavy words, and we'll do a work song. And that's Black and Blue. And we virtually wrote Black and Blue at the very first practice Chain had.
Wow. And I'm sure you weren't looking for mainstream chart success with that. You weren't intending to be pop stars, but you did get that success. And it's an amazing achievement for a blues band to top the mainstream charts. Did the enormity of that sink in with you at the time?
Oh, no. Again, in the show, I say that we record Black and Blue on the way down to Melbourne. We recorded in Sydney. Then we get back to Melbourne and we're working really hard. And then Black and Blue's released. And there was only one chart anyone took any notice of. That was the 3XY chart, because they were the top pop station in Melbourne. And when Black and Blue's released in 3XY, the number one record's I'll Be Gone by Spectrum.
Mm.
And Black and Blue knocks, and that I'll Be Gone had been number one for 7 weeks. Black and Blue comes along, knocks off I'll Be Gone, and it's number one for 18 weeks. And it takes a little song called Eagle Rock by Daddy Cool to knock Black and Blue off the charts. So, and it was number one for 25 weeks. So if you add all that up, there was a music chart in Australia where Australia topped that chart for a year. And I don't think that's ever happened before.
I doubt it.
Certainly never happened since.
Yeah.
But that just shows you how strong the Melbourne music scene was in the early 70s. It was just amazing. And even with Black and Blue, I remember going into one of the other ones, 3AW or one of those, and we went in there and I leaned over and I said to the DJ, I said, look, thanks for playing Black and Blue. And he actually says to me, I wouldn't play this shit except that it's number one. and that gives you some idea. There was a lot of people who really didn't want pop music to change.
Mm.
They liked it the way it was. They wanted it all fluffy and furry and pretty much to what it's gone back to today. But and I suppose when it got to the point where they didn't have to play Chain anymore, we were dropped very quickly.
Yeah.
And just went back to being another blues band.
But not to be outdone, you found similar chart success yourself as a solo act. With I remember when I was young. What do you recall of the writing of that song?
Well, that's another story where I was living on a commune when Chain broke up. I got involved in what you'd call the very early environmental movement. There was no movement, and people who were talking about, pollution and everything were just looked at as fucking idiots, and so I started writing songs with an environmental theme in them, and eventually I go and live on a commune where we grow our own food and make our own bread and the whole thing like that. And I don't, the experience with change just put me off music for a while. And so I wrote a few songs before the commune and wrote, obviously, some of them afterwards. So as the commune was coming to an end, I'd read this book and it said, if you want enlightenment, fast for 1 day for every year you've been alive. And I thought, oh, that's pretty easy. I'm 23. All I have to do is live on water for 23 days and I'll be enlightened. After 2 weeks, people are coming up saying, Matt, you're going to die. You were thin to start off with, and, you're even thinner now. So I broke the fast, and about 10 days later, I'm up in the dam where all the water for the communes are stored. And I'm thinking, how on earth has all this come about? And then it just comes into my head, I'll tell you, when I was young, the world had just begun and I was happy. I used to wonder about the earth and how it moved around the sun so snappy. And I thought, what a great line. So I ran down to the farmhouse, pulled out an old guitar I hadn't touched in about 7 or 8 months. It had dirty old strings, and I just got a very basic bomper together, and I had a gardening book and a felt pen, and I just wrote the words down. I can't remember now whether it was the next day or later that day, I go back and look at it, and I see, I'll tell you, when I was young, I thought, no, back when I was young. And just as I was about to write back, I just wrote, I remember when I was young. And that's where it came from. Mm. And eventually, after we left the commune, I was living at Frankston. Frankston in those days was just purely rural. We were living on a great big farm, probably 100-acre farm. And one day, this Jaguar starts bumping up the road to the farmhouse, and it's Michael Gudinski. And he comes in and says, I don't even think he said g'day. He just looked at me and says, Matt, you got any songs? I said, I've got tons of them. He says, I'm starting a new record label called Mushroom. Do you want to be on it? I said, look, I don't think I'm quite ready to go into the city yet. And he said, don't worry, we'll bring the recording studio out to the farm, which they did. And I remember when I was young, it was recorded in a paddock beside the farmhouse. If you get the old Straight as a Die album, you can see photos of us playing out in the open. And that's where I remember when I was young, virtually recorded live.
Open air recording. It must have been a magic session.
Oh, it was. It was just incredible. And we were there for 3 days, just before Sunbury 73, I think it was. So we recorded it, and we're all sitting down having a drink or something like that, and the police come up and they said, God, we've been searching for you guys for 3 days. People have been complaining, 8 miles away, And I said, oh, look, sorry to put you to the inconvenience, but we're finished now. So, so they were fairly good-humoured about it and just went off. But I thought it was so funny, just 3 days, and they just couldn't find us because all the hills and valleys where the music will just drop into a valley, and it'll be as loud as if you're standing in front of it.
You were still a young man in his 20s when you wrote that song. Does it take on a new significance to you now, being a man in your 60s?
Yeah, well, when, with the introduction to Oz Blues, I started off, and I actually do Judgment from Chain, which is about a young guy, a Australian blues musician being on the road in 1970. And then I do a song called Another Way of Playing the Blues, which I wrote in 2014, a mere 44 years later. So they're very different songs, and I've always been interested in, where music comes from and everything like that. And with Another Way of Playing the Blues, it just starts off rock and roll one day appeared. And I was young enough to have heard the pre-rock and roll and post-rock and roll, and also in that story, I tell how my sister's 4 years older than me, so she was right in the middle of, she was a teenager in the original rock and roll era. And she had all the records, Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, and I inherited them all. And luckily for me is that Joan, because I was just an impudent little kid, they had to take me, they couldn't go to the Lee Gordon shows, with Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and all these without taking me. So luckily I saw all of those guys. And it didn't mean a great deal to me at the time, but it must have been sinking in.
Yeah.
Because soon as I heard the blues, I realized, wow, I'd seen these, I'd seen Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis and Buddy Holly, of all people, though I can't remember anything about that. I was 11. And but it's all there. It all sunk in.
You got to tour with many of your blues heroes. You spent time with the likes of Muddy Waters, Willie Dixon.
Oh, yeah.
Any standout memories there?
Well, the most standout memory is a really strange one. Everywhere we'd go, you'd have kids with 30 albums under their arms, and and they'd be asking Muddy Waters the same 10 questions. Did you know Robert Johnson? Did you, what was Little Walter like? And Muddy was just lovely. He'd answer them, I saw him answer most of those questions 5 times. And there was a million things I wanted to ask Muddy. And at one stage, myself and Muddy, I think we were, the band had already gone to set up and everything. So myself and Muddy are sitting together, waiting for to get picked up and taken to the gig. And there was a million things I wanted to ask him, but I just didn't ask her. I just sat there with him. And we sat there for 10 minutes and didn't say a word to each other. And then when the guys came to the lift, Muddy got up walked to the door, looked at me, and gave me the biggest smile as though, thank you very much for not asking me the 800 questions. And I think that's my greatest memory of them.
Yeah, that's a great story. I recall seeing your band Western Flyer a few times in the late 70s. I really liked that band. Did you have high hopes for that band?
Oh, yeah. It hit, like I can remember when Western Flyer was recording First Flight, and someone had bought a Rolling Stone magazine, and in that Rolling Stone was an interview with the Sex Pistols, and so Western Flyer was just the wrong band at the wrong time.
Mm.
You know, a terrific band. And when you listen to the stuff today, like the live one, the harmonies are really good, and it was such a great musical band. It's the only band I've ever been in my life that had to break up because it was just too expensive. We just could not earn enough money to keep it on the road.
Mm.
It never broke up for any other reason. And it was, it was right at the start of the punk era, and it broke up, and then I got together with Dave Hull, and it was the Matt Taylor Dave Hull band, a Matt Taylor band featuring Dave Hull was called, and that was the only touring blues band in the whole punk era. And I can remember doing a gig once, I think it was Seven Hills in Sydney, and we pulled if you pulled 300 people in those days, it wasn't a good gig. If you pulled 300 today, you'd be thinking, oh, wow, how good is that? But in those days, I remember we pulled 300 people. I went to see the boss at the end of the night to pick up the money. And I said, oh, I'm sorry that, we only pulled 300 people. He said, Matt, I'd rather have your 300 than, the 700 I got last night for the punk band. I had to replace all the toilets were smashed. The doors were crashed. And he said, it was just a pleasure, your crowd. So, and I think that's what kept. It was I suppose it was the chain crowd, but it was the blues crowd that didn't turn up in gigantic quantities, but there was enough of them to keep that band. We used to do 8-week tours of Australia. And that was right in the middle of the punk era, and I'll tell you this story. This is fantastic. I think it was in Bondi. There was one of the biggest punk venues in Australia was in Bondi, just up the hill a little bit, and for some reason they'd booked the Matt Taylor band featuring Dave Hull into a really full-on punk venue. So for about the first 15 minutes, they're just looking at us thinking, oh my God, what are these guys, And then all of a sudden, they started to get onto the dance floor and bump into each other. And by the end of the night, it was just absolute chaos. There's people sliding. There was a banister. There's people sliding down this banister, and they're swinging off the rafters. And we actually got an encore. They loved it. And about a year later, I'm at the Mansell room, and this young fella comes up and he said, Matt, remember that night, I think it was something Pacific Hotel or something, remember that night you played at that venue, I said, yeah. I said it was an amazing gig. And he said, well, he says, I was one of the punks in the audience, and I'd never heard blues before, and now I play in a blues band. So, good things were happening. You just chip away all the time, and you just kept the flame of blues alive as much as you could.
And the blues didn't enjoy a high profile in the 80s, but in the mid 80s you got the classic chain lineup back together. Was it a challenge taking a blues band back on the road in that area?
Oh no! I think people were just waiting for it, and it was such a good band. The amazing thing about Chain is that we had a number one record before we'd actually heard a black blues band. All the big tours and everything didn't start till 73. Like Muddy probably came out 4 or 5 times, and I did 2 of those tours, and Willie Dixon, I did his tour all over Australia and New Zealand, and Freddie King and all these guys, B.B. King. I've actually played with the 3 Kings, Albert King, B.B. King, and Freddie King.
Wow.
I've done shows with them, yeah. So, we were already playing Oz Blues without even knowing it. I tell this story that I'm not in Chain at the time, but I'm still touring with them, and they played on I Remember When I Was Young. That's Chain.
Yeah.
So we're still touring together with Muddy Waters, and we go to the sound check, and we thought that blues was that blues bands just played like us. We were actually a blues band that played like a jazz band. We'd make up most of the stuff. We were jamming all the time. And you didn't realize that we thought Muddy was the same, but it was so closely orchestrated, Muddy's band. It was a fabulous band. But I can remember they're at the sound check, and Muddy stops the band. No, and he goes up to George Mojo Beaufort, who was the harp player, and says, no, you don't play it that way. You play. And we're just sitting there like stunned mullets. We thought that, it was just free and everyone could just play whatever they wanted. And you realise that it was really tightly orchestrated. So that was our first sort of insight into how the blues worked in, and it was because the blues had grown out of music from the turn of the century and the 1920s, and it had evolved into rock and roll and evolved into a dozen other kind of things. So it was really part of our learning experience. But we'd already had a style of playing.
Now, to the present day, I've noticed you've been using YouTube recently as a means of getting your songs out. That must be a really rewarding experience and one that could give you immediate feedback from your fans.
Yeah, well, I don't think a lot of people know about it because you've got to put in Matt Taylor Oz Blues. If you put in Matt Taylor, you get Matt Taylor the shipbuilder, Matt Taylor the soccer player, Matt Taylor the weather forecast, and my favourite of all, Matt Taylor the, what's his name, one of those young, oh God, what I can't even. Justin Bieber impersonator.
Oh, wow.
It was an actual Matt Taylor Justin Bieber impersonator. So you've got to put in Matt Taylor Oz Blues, and that'll save you from Mr. Bieber.
Yeah.
But the reason I basically do that is that I've written thousands of songs, and even when you see Chain, we throw in a lot of new songs, but we just can't throw in enough, because every time you throw in a new one, you've got to take one of the old ones out. And I can remember one night we didn't do Grab a Snatch and Hold It. And at the end of the night, a girl comes up to me and she says, "We drove 150 kilometres to see this show, and you didn't play my favourite song, Grab a Snatch and Hold It, and kicked me in the shin." So that was the end of never doing Grab a Snatch and Hold It again. So you know, Black and Blue, Grab a Snatch and Hold It, a few of those ones you've just got to always do.
Yeah.
If you don't do them, so you can add some new songs. And a lot of it's like Phil does his solo show. So there's a lot of songs that don't fit Chain. It's better if people hear them than they're just stuck away in my filing cabinet somewhere. I think I've got something like 60 songs, of which probably 50 are absolute originals that I just recorded, and things like Brisbane to Beechworth. I just put that on because people like it, and I thought I'll just put a live version on and they can hear it. So you know, and I started putting the previous show that I did, which was called Blues to Oz Blues, where I traced the whole story of how blues came to Australia in more detail than what the present show does. And I got sick, and then when so I was pretty much out of the music business for about 6 months. So when I came back, I started working on the new show. So I have no idea what I'll do with the Blues to Oz Blues show. You can find it, your listeners can look it up and find it on YouTube.
For sure. Now, this show is very much like a combination storytelling and live performing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I try and weave it all together. I play some Oz blues, and then I just go on to the Rolling Stones. I tell how the blues as we know it today only started to appear in the folk revival of the late 50s, and then the trad jazz revival. In fact, you can trace the Rolling Stones back to the trad jazz revival of 1958. So, and then I say that it's the post-Beatles era where blues really hits Australia in a big way, mainly with the Rolling Stones, the Animals, but it's the Rolling Stones who are the major contributors. And I tell this story of I'm a raging Beatles fan. I'm 14 years old, and I buy this magazine called Fabulous, and I'm looking through Fabulous, and I see a picture of this band, and this band looks exactly the way I feel, and it's the Rolling Stones. And I don't realize that band would turn me on to a music I'd play for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So I do a little song. It's called "The Breath of a Rolling Stone." You can find it on YouTube, and that just really says how the Rolling Stones not only helped turn Europe on to the blues and Australia, but it also reintroduced the blues to America.
That's right.
And then I tell the story about B.B. King. In 1965 or 66, B.B. King plays the Apollo Theatre, the great Afro-American showcase in Harlem, and people in the audience boo him because he hasn't got a shiny suit and he hasn't got any moves.
Good.
Because that's the music they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And then a week later, he plays to the hippies in Fillmore West and gets a standing ovation. Those hippies hadn't been introduced to the blues by B.B. King. They'd been introduced to the blues by the Rolling Stones and the Animals and all those guys. Fleetwood Mac. So that really, if you're a young guy who started getting into the blues 35 years ago, you wouldn't know that it was the English who actually introduced it to the world.
That's right. That's very true.
Yeah.
And Matt, just before I let you go, upcoming plans. What else is in your books for the rest of this year?
Let's have a look. Luckily, I've got my book here. I've got a show coming up in Perth at the Astor, and that's the trouble. Is there's not much call for what I do these days, so I just do some when I can. And then we've got a private gig for Chain up in Cairns, of all places. And then my daughter lives in London, so I'm going to visit her in September and October. So, if you want to go and see Chain, just never let the opportunity go past, because we don't play very often. If we play 12 gigs a year, we're doing well. It's a different world now, and it's a shame that in a way that I've got to go out and do an introduction to Oz Blues to tell people about their own musical history.
Yeah, true.
And but that's what you've got to do. When I decided to play the blues, when I decided to play Oz Blues, which is a small counterculture music within a small counterculture music, you can't expect too much. But I want to, and I feel that, when I eventually go, I'm going to leave a good blueprint for Oz Blues, and hopefully young kids will, get into Australian blues more than copying American blues.
That will be good. Hey, Matt, it's a rare treat to have you in town, so we look forward to seeing the show, and thank you for all those years of flying the flag for blues in this country.
My absolute pleasure.
Okay. All the best. Have a safe flight over, and we look forward to seeing you.
Fantastic. Yeah, come up and say good day.
Will do. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Okay, bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.